What's the deal, everybody? It's your boy Shane G, Ethos Media Network. Just dropping a live on y'all today. Just wanted to discuss something that's been um in the news, but not really in the news as much as you would kind of think it would be. Action. Um it was, I believe, recently struck down and declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And we'll get into one of those individuals who actually voted against affirmative action and stated that it was unconstitutional. We'll speak about that individual and why it's sort of ironic that he voted the way he did. But I just want to put it in context. And we're going to use the dictionary definition because I've seen you know very right-wing interpretations of the definition of affirmative action, which is basically just discriminate against white people, um, which isn't really what it is. Um, and then there was another, there's the more super left-wing interpretation of what it is, which is just only helping minority, not discriminating against minorities, and that's not necessarily what it is either. So let's just get the dictionary definition of it. So blow this up here. There we go. So let's read this together. So affirmative action in the United States, an active effort to improve employment or educational opportunities for members of minority groups and for women. Affirmative action began as a government remedy to the effects of long-standing discrimination against such groups and has consisted of policies, programs, and procedures that give limited preferences to minorities and women in job hiring, admission to institutions of higher education, the awarding of government contracts, and other social benefits. The typical criteria for affirmative action are race, disability, gender, ethnic origin, and age. So that's the Encyclopedia Britannica definition of affirmative action, right? So that's what it is. Now, the reason I bring this up is because, like I said recently, and we'll bring this up here, there was a case that was brought before the Supreme Court, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. So now, this is Wikipedia, so some people complain about Wikipedia being, accurate or not, but I feel like it's a good comprehension of, basically most of the information that's out there. So, um, Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard is a landmark decision of the Supreme Court of the United States in which the court held that race-based affirmative action programs and college admissions processes violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. With its companion case, Students for Fair Admissions versus University of North Carolina, the Supreme Court effectively overruled Grutter versus Boilinger, a 2003 case, and Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, a 1978 case, which validated some affirmative action in college admissions, provided that race had a limited role in decisions. In 2013, SFFA filed suit against Harvard University in U.S. District Court in Boston, alleging that the university's undergraduate admissions practices violated Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 by discriminating against Asian Americans in favor of white applicants. In 2019, a district court judge upheld Harvard's limited use of race as a factor in admissions, stating lack of evidence for discriminatory animus or conscious prejudice. In 2020, the U.S. Court of Appeals in the first court affirmed the district court's ruling. In 2021, SFFA petitioned the Supreme Court, which agreed to hear their case. Following the appointment of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, a member of the Harvard Board of Overseers at the time, the cases were split, with Jackson recusing from the Harvard case while participating in the North Carolina one. On June 29th, 2023, the Supreme Court issued a decision in Harvard that, by a vote of 6-2, reversed the lower court ruling. In writing the majority opinion, Chief Justice John Roberts held that affirmative action in college admissions is unconstitutional. The court did not decide whether race based affirmative action can continue in U.S. military academies, which the Solicitor General urged the court to continue to allow in the government's amicus brief. Interesting. So they don't want affirmative action for educational institutions and college, but for the military, they're like, leave that one alone. Let us still do it for that. That's interesting. So, why do I think that this is a bad idea and that they should leave this alone and try to course correct, right? Well, let's go over some history. So everybody knows about slavery, obviously, right? So now I read something really good. I hope I still have it in my phone. Because when you break it down like this, it's a lot more inflammatory what actually happened during slavery. I'm going to see if I still have it. I think I do. I really, really hope I do. Let's see. Because when you look at it in these terms, it really does make you think about it a lot differently. Um, because you sort of get desensitized. I do have it right here. So shout out to Absurdist Words on Twitter. Clear language on slavery. Okay. So, clear language on slavery. Slaves in modern terms. If we were to modernize the language of what happened during slavery, this is everything that happened. So slaves were hostages, slave owners were human traffickers, slave catchers were police, plantations were death camps, mistresses were rape victims, discipline was torture and murder, overseers were torturers, trading was kidnapping, profit was theft, middle passage was a genocide. Those are the words we use today. We call the most evil scum of the word human traffickers. They're rapists, kidnappers, people who commit genocide. And slaves are hostages. That's a lot more. That's a lot more palatable in today's words, because we can conceptualize those things a lot easier, because in America we haven't had actual, I mean, aside from prison, of course, we haven't had slavery, in America, debates on wage slavery, that aside, like, I mean, actual forced labor type slavery outside of prison, we haven't actually had that in the United States, in a long time. So that's why you have to change the language, because it's easy to just make it seem like it's something that happened a long time ago and it's whatever, you know what I mean? Like, but when you put it in those words, it's like, oh, that's what happened. So let's continue. Start replacing the words you commonly hear and read about slavery in your head. Bookmark this as a reference. Start using everyday words that are relevant to you in this day and age. Stop obscuring the horror with detached, antiquated, euphemistic terms. So, slave families lived in plantations owned by white slave owners who hired overseers to maintain discipline. That's the old way of saying it. In a modern way, you would say black families were held hostage in death camps by white human traffickers who employed torturers to torture and kill them. That's a different way of viewing that same thing. Mr. Johnson, a philanthropist and slave owner, demanded in his will that his slaves be freed upon his death. That new sentence would be Mr. Johnson, philanthropist and human trafficker, declares that his family of black hostages will be freed over his dead body. That's literally what that means. Be freed upon his death, over his dead body. That's the only time my family of black hostages, they'll be freed over my dead body. That's what that would turn into today. The U.S. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which obligated white Americans to return slaves to their masters' plantations. Now, that is, Congress passed the Escaping Black Families Act, which obligated whites to return terrified black families to the death camps of their kidnappers. That hits way different. The prominent slave owner never publicly recognized the offspring of he and one of his slave romances, but allowed him to serve in the house. That becomes the rich human trafficker raped his female hostage and then held their son hostage as well at the death camp he owned. It's a lot different. We abolished slavery way back in 1865. There's no need to still be talking about it now. Even though it has been only two human lifetimes back to back since it was fully legal to kidnap, torture, rape, and murder black people, there's no reason to still be upset. It's different. The way we talk about harm that we cause matters. It is reflexive of us to minimize the harm we inflict and tend to hide the severity of that harm behind spin and fuzzy language. And this doesn't allow for real accountability or compassion or even an apology. If someone punches you in the face and then breaks your nose, you're not likely to accept the apology, "I'm sorry I annoyed you." Why? Because although a broken nose is also annoying, by only admitting to that minor consequence, they avoid facing the core of what they really did wrong. History books essentially paint slavery as an alternative society structure, perhaps unjust and a bit ugly, but valid. Sanitized terms and images of Gone with the Wind romanticize even these horrific atrocities and those behind them. When we cannot come to terms with and acknowledge the full enormity of our actions, not only can we never be accountable to those we've harmed, but we make their pain and anger seem illegitimate and arbitrary and without cause or validity. Words matter. So the reason I bring all that up is because the initial reason that affirmative action was introduced was because you got to think of the way I just described everything. That happened for 400 years while not all white people, but a lot of white people, especially white people in the South, directly benefited from the labor of that. As far as patents, things that I just recently found out that, a black man was the person who came up with Jack Daniels, but he wasn't allowed to patent anything or have a lawyer or anything like that when he did it. So all that generational wealth that could have been, built up within a black family went to a white family. You know what I mean? Now imagine how many times that happened over and over. So recognizing that and recognizing that, okay, post slavery, you had redlining, you had separate but equal, the Jim Crow era where, black schools were being purposely underfunded and things of this nature. And then bring it to the modern era. How is that still done? Black families, more often than not, inner cities are going to have more families of color, I'll say it that way, um, than they do, white families. So how do schools get their funding? It's usually off property taxes, and property value is what determines property taxes. So if they deem inner cities, neighborhoods to be of lower value, then the schools aren't going to be funded as much. And then most colleges are accepting people based on test scores, SATs, ACTs, things of this nature. What are those tests based off of? They're based off of suburban level education. So the things that are being taught regularly in suburban schools, maybe some private schools, things like that, in more affluent areas, that's what the tests are based on. They're not based on the level that's being taught in the inner city, possibly because of lack of resources or because of overcrowded classrooms or, whatever the issues are. You know what I mean? It's not necessarily due to a lack of intelligence or a lack of ability. It's usually more so a lack of resources. So when you're being tested on these things that whoever implements the SATs and ACTs expects you to know, if you've never been taught them at the same level that the other people have, like you're at an unfair advantage. So all of these things um accumulated are the reason that affirmative action was here. And so now, they're making the argument that because of Martin Luther King and the anti-discrimination laws that were passed, that makes affirmative action racist. And apparently they're using the argument that it's racist against Asians, specifically at Harvard. They're saying that Asians have a hard time getting into Harvard because of affirmative action, because they have to let people in, who don't have the same credentials as them. And the issue is with that is, again, if you do like an IQ test, which is based off of the same type of education system that, standardized testing is based on, when you're not looking at a person's actual intelligence, their ability to solve problems, their ability to retain information, their ability to, perform a task, things of this nature. You're not looking at that. You're looking at what's in their head, what has been taught to them, and what do they know now. So that's not really judging somebody's ability fairly, which is where affirmative action was giving people a chance. Like, okay, if this person has a 2.7, that might be the equivalent of this other person's like 3.2, just based on where they're from. I hope that makes sense. It's based on what you've been taught in school and the type of education you're receiving. And not only that, but we also have to remember the outside factors, that factor in. If you're going home and you have a comfortable environment to go to, you're probably more likely to be able to focus on your studies and succeed in those areas versus somebody who goes home and doesn't know if they're going to have anything to eat, or if they have abusive parents, or there's drugs around, or whatever the case is. So those are just some of the reasons why affirmative action was, implemented. So I just wanted to provide context for people who were like, why did they just, you know what I mean? Like, just make it so that black people had it easier to get into places. It's like there's a lot of context that gets left out of that. And here's two other very interesting articles. One's actually a study. I'm just going to read the main paragraph of the study. And then another one is an article. Um, this is called The Visible Hand: Race and Online Market Outcomes. Now, this is a very interesting study, and this is another reason why things like affirmative action are necessary. In my opinion, I feel like they are very necessary. This was conducted in 2010, so not that long ago. So, it reads: The Visible Hand: Race and Online Market Outcomes. This was done by Jennifer L. Doliak and Luke C.D. Stein in May 2010. So it reads: We examine the effect of race on market outcomes by selling iPods through local online classified advertisements throughout the United States in a year-long field experiment. Each ad features a photograph of a product being held by a dark or light-skinned black or white hand. So the dark hands are black people, the light hands are white people. To provide context, we also consider a group of sellers against whom buyers might statistically discriminate for similar reasons. White sellers with wrist tattoos. Black sellers do worse with white sellers that was an example. So they were factoring in, like, okay, maybe it's not the skin color, maybe it's because, the black hand has tattoos on it. So let's get a white hand with tattoos and see how that one does in comparison. Things like that. Black sellers do worse than white sellers on a variety of market outcome measures. They receive 13% fewer responses and 17% fewer offers. These effects are strongest in the Northeast and are similar in magnitude to those associated with the display of a wrist tattoo. Conditional on receiving at least one offer, black sellers also receive 2 to 4% lower offers despite the self-selected and presumably less biased pool of buyers. In addition, buyers corresponding with black sellers exhibit lower trust. They are 17% less likely to include their name in emails, 44% less likely to accept delivery by mail, and 56% more likely to express concern about making a long distance payment. We find evidence that black sellers suffer particularly poor outcomes in thin markets. It appears that discrimination may not survive in the presence of significant competition among buyers. Furthermore, black sellers do worst in the most racially isolated markets and markets with high property crime rates, suggesting a role for statistical discrimination in explaining the disparity. So basically, just to wrap that up in a nice bow, what they're saying is when you have a black hand that's selling an iPod all over America for a whole year, and you have a white hand that's selling the same thing, it's the exact same product, everything else is the same. You can read the study for yourself. That's the name of it. Um, White sellers do way better in basically all those areas. Why is that? Why would that be? You can't blame it on, you can't say you judge everybody as an individual and that kind of stuff, and then that is the outcome. It would be pretty much 50-50 across the board. If that's, it would just be some people pick the white hand, some people pick the black hand. It had nothing to do with it. And then the other interesting factor is they included people with tattoos got less less traction on the attempting to sell on the iPod. So all of that's, it's, what does that tell you? That's all I'm saying. You have to look at these things. And then finally, we have the name discrimination study, which finds Lakeisha and Jamal are still less likely to get hired than Emily and Greg. So 2 decades ago, a black woman named Kalisha White applied for a team leader position at Target and worried that her application had been ignored because of her race. So she sent it back in with a different name and slightly fewer qualifications. That application got her the interview. Eventually, she won a class action lawsuit against the massive retailer. So let me just break that down real quick. This woman, Lakeisha White, sent in an application with good stats on the resume. Got ignored. She refills it out with a fake name, has less qualifications on it than she originally put, and she got the interview. Okay? And as a result, she sued Target and got paid. 2 decades later, a new study shows that not much has changed. Economists Oh, okay. I was just making sure it was big. Economists from the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of Chicago sent 83,000 job applications to 108 Fortune 500 employers, half with traditionally white sounding names and the other half with distinctively black sounding names. Applicants with black names were called back 10% fewer times across the board, and even less when it came to specific companies, despite having comparable applications to their white counterparts. Berkeley economist Patrick Klein, and by the way, this is on what is WBUR.org is this website. Berkeley economist Patrick Klein, one of the study's authors, says the applications looked realistic. Researchers crafted resumes and automated the process of filling out employment history and personality tests. To our knowledge, we actually have the highest response rate that we've ever been garnered from one of these studies. Some of the common white names used were Emily or Greg, he says, and distinctively black names used included Jamal or Lakeisha. The study's authors used these names as a way of trying to understand discrimination in the employment application process. The study's authors have not yet followed up with the companies. Klein says he assumes these companies would have a difficult time answering why they favored one applicant over another. The companies were the companies were chosen based on their national employment footprint, Klein says. Ultimately, some human somewhere makes the final call on hiring, he explains, but many major companies' hiring decisions are spread across the U.S. and utilize screening algorithms and third-party technology. Discrimination was more prevalent at decentralized companies where the hiring process is spread out, he says, as opposed to a company with one location with specialized human resource employees. What we think is going on here is that some places have different hiring practices than others. In some places, it's not very internally regulated by HR practices, he says. So whoever's maybe working a shift at the restaurant that day can sift through the applications and just decide who they want to call in for an interview next week. At other places, there's more hoops that you have to jump through before you decide to call someone back. A trained HR specialist may be more likely to recognize bias or specifically look for diverse applicants, he says. The study's researchers shared their findings with the Department of Labor. Testing for discrimination is arduous, he says, so the department was interested in looking over the study's scientific measurements of discrimination. All right, so yeah, Legal battles over discrimination are often based on a single complaint backed by the fact that a company employs a small number of people from a certain group, he says. But since a number of reasons could explain the disparity, it's tough to prove that discrimination exists in these cases. By keeping the external factors constant, the study was able to show that discrimination is more concentrated than previous research found, he said. For example, the top 20% of the most discriminatory firms in the study were responsible for 50% of the callbacks lost to discrimination, which surprised researchers. It suggests that this really isn't a needle in the haystack problem, he says, and it does seem possible that perhaps by imitating the best practices of the companies that are doing a good job in terms of bias, that the 20% of companies that seem to be doing a very bad job can get their act together and provide a more equitable, inclusive workplace. Discrimination. Now, this is the most interesting part. This was the part that, really jumped out to me. Discrimination against black names was most prevalent in the auto services and dealership industry, the study found. Klein says discrimination was concentrated in customer facing industries such as restaurants and retail and clothing sectors. Industries without customer facing roles, like jobs in freight and transportation industries, showed low discrimination levels against black names. So, do you understand what that means? What that means is that jobs where you're speaking to people, where you're possibly serving people, you're helping people, things like that, those are the jobs that have the highest amount of discrimination against people with black sounding names. But if you're working in the back, jobs in freight, transportation industries, um, so if you're the cook, you're good. They'll probably hire you to be the cook. They're probably less likely to hire you to be the server. That's what that means. That's interesting. So not much has changed since Kalisha White's own experiment with Target, but Klein says this study suggests HR policies, such as mandating that someone higher up than a local manager sign off on callback decisions, can help turn backers onto the good side. So pretty much what they concluded from this was they essentially concluded from this that when there's a good HR department, basically that's doing their best to not have discriminatory practices, or they're doing their best to have a diverse work environment, that those companies do better at it, versus where there's more of a hiring process in place, versus where it's like there's one person that's kind of in charge of hiring everybody and it's a smaller company or things like that. The discrimination is likely to be higher in those situations. So that was that main takeaway there. But you know, there's two very important things right there. The that show that the ability to engage monetarily in the United States is much more difficult for black people. Those are two studies that I just showed you right there that basically show that. So, that those are the reasons why. And then again, going back to all the history that we spoke about already, those are the reasons why this is important. Um Now, this might be speculation on my part, but I don't know if, the affirmative action ruling and ESPN letting go of everybody pretty much that same week, I think. I don't know if that had anything to do with the other. I don't know. I'm speculating. I don't know. But here's the last thing that I want to talk about. And this is a guy who benefited from affirmative action and then voted against it. It's Judge Clarence Thomas. So, how Clarence Thomas came to reject affirmative action, this is from the New York Times. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, the second black justice to sit on the court after Thurgood Marshall, has spent years opposing affirmative action. When the High Court struck down the policy last month, Justice Thomas was one of the most influential figures behind the ruling. Abby Van Sickle, who covers the Supreme Court for the Times, explains the impact affirmative action has had on Justice Thomas's life and how he helped bring it about its demise. So let's see here. Okay. So look at his path to the Supreme Court. So you have to subscribe to the New York Times. Ew. Well, basically, look, this is the whole thing about him. All you need to know is that he was a beneficiary of the affirmative action system. So he would have never been a judge without affirmative action, and he just struck it down. That's the main takeaway. That's all you need to know about that article right there. So, most of your a lot of your favorite, a lot of people, man, wouldn't have been in school in college and been able to do the things that they did without affirmative action or gotten the jobs that they got and been successful at. Like, let's not pretend that, college has a way of weeding people out. If you don't put in the work, if you don't do the studies, you know what I mean? Like, it's not like they have study or they have classes that you can start that will catch you up to where you need to be to take the more advanced classes. Like, they have those. So, it's not like all of a sudden you're starting off at calculus as soon as you get to college. Like, that's not how it works. So they have, so when I say it has a way of weeding itself out, if somebody got let in who didn't have a good GPA and, you know, they fail out of school, that's on them at that point. You know what I mean? Like, they made the decision to not do the necessary work to stay because the resources are there. They have tutors. They have, like I said, the more essentially high school type math classes and science classes and things like that that allow you to catch up, you know. Um so, it has a way of weeding itself out. So, at the end of the day, I don't think it's a good thing for black people specifically. I don't think it's a good thing for minorities, because if they're saying that affirmative action was used to discriminate against Asians by white people with no affirmative action, that's not going to help Asians get into the school at a higher rate. Like, especially when you have things like there's other forms of affirmative action that aren't illegal. You know what I mean? Having a parent that went to the school, having rich parents, things like that. That'll definitely be a form of, having somebody who's in the frat and, the president of the university's in the same frat. And all these things, all of these things play a role. So what they were doing was allowing people who didn't have those, legacies that went to the school basically have a fair shake. So that's my opinion of it. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people that disagree. They're going to say that affirmative action is racist against white people, um, despite everything I laid out in the video. But, it's cool, man. Everybody has their own perspective. I don't expect to necessarily change everybody's mind, but I'm just hoping that some people who, watch these and listen to them, maybe leave with a different perspective. That would be dope. I've had my perspective changed by people I disagree with. So hopefully, we take that approach and we're not necessarily you know, uh going at each other's throats in the comments or anything like that. But this is Shane G. This is just a live, just a live on the Ethos Media Network channel. Make sure you follow us on Instagram and Threads at Ethos Media Network. Make sure you check out the bar exam if you're into music. Check out the bar exam every Monday. Um, check out Politics as Usual, which is my show where I speak on more political issues. I drop those every Saturday. And yeah, so appreciate the support, everybody. Y'all have a good week. A good end of your week. Good end of your week. Today is Friday, right? Today's Friday. Yeah. Y'all have a good weekend then. How about that? Man, I'll see you tomorrow for Politics as Usual. Peace.